Hello and welcome back to another episode of Hollywood Wargaming, and today we have another entry in our Bolt Action Unit Guide, a comprehensive ongoing series that is meant to cover all of the weapon profiles and unit types in Bolt Action, and today we are going to be taking a look at vehicle-mounted flamethrowers. Now, in our previous video, we covered the standard infantry flamethrower team, and in that video, I pretty much bemoaned its existence as a unit, at least in its current incarnation. And while this weapon profile is more or less an upgraded version when mounted on a vehicle, I do believe that, due to the mechanics and point scaling of Bolt Action, it is actually a far more balanced weapon when it exists in this format. And there are a couple reasons for that we will go over later on in this video. But for now, let's go ahead and take a look at the weapon profile for the vehicle-mounted flamethrower. And here, you are going to be getting a weapon that usually comes in around 50 points when you break down the vehicle's cost, which means a tank with this weapon mounted on it will come in around the same cost as something with a light anti-tank gun or light howitzer. That comparison, however, is considering that this weapon would be mounted in the turret. There are a few variations of flame tanks throughout Bolt Action, and while most of them do have their primary weapon swapped out for the flamethrower, there are examples, such as the Churchill Crocodile, that make use of a hull-mounted flamethrower and also a cannon still inside the turret. And much like other vehicles that have two primary armaments mounted on them, like the Char B1 Bis with its hull-mounted howitzer, this is going to greatly increase the points cost of this vehicle, as you are packing two very prominent weapon profiles into one unit. But as I mentioned earlier, most flame vehicles in Bolt Action are making use of a turret-mounted flamethrower, or in some scenarios have dummy turrets or turrets that just have MMGs in them, because as it would turn out in real life, it's very difficult to store large quantities of flammable fluid, along with racks and racks of high-caliber ordnance. It is also worth mentioning that there are some vehicles in the game that have multiple flamethrowers mounted on them, such as the 251-16 or the Panzer II Flamingo. And before you get too excited at the idea of firing multiple flamethrowers off at once, know that the multiple flamethrower special rule does only allow you to fire one at a time. So when you do see a vehicle mounted with multiple flamethrowers, the real bonus here is usually covering side arcs, rather than actually having a stacking weapon profile, which honestly could get really out of hand really fast, so hats off to Warlord Games for balancing something appropriately. But regardless of how many flamethrowers you have or where they are mounted, you are still going to be using the same weapon profile, which is going to be a 12-inch ranged attack, one that upon hitting your target is going to apply d6 plus 1 hits with a penetration value of 3. So as we can see here, this is very similar to the standard flamethrower stat line, however its range has been doubled, and you are going to receive a flat +1 bonus to the amount of hits you would score with this weapon, which is an upgrade from the standard d6 roll of the infantry flamethrower. But the obvious bonus here is the fact that this weapon is going to be firing at 12-inch range, which again is double that of the standard infantry flamethrower. However, you are going to be suffering a -1 to hits if you are firing beyond 6-inch range. And that means in the usual scenario, when you are engaging your opponents for the first time in a match with this weapon, you will have moved and will be targeting them at long range, meaning you're likely going to be hitting them on a roll of 5, which isn't exactly as ideal as a flamethrower jumping out of a Jeep at 3-inch range and hitting them on a 3+. But if this gives you one more chance to attack with the flamethrower than you would be able to if it was 6-inch, then it is undeniably an advantage. But once we further analyze the medium on which this weapon profile exists, we will realize that that 12-inch range isn't quite as much as a buff as it may initially seem, as the infantry support variant is going to have a little bit more flexibility, which will have implications on its mobility and effective range. However, the vehicle-mounted flamethrower is going to have all the benefits of the standard flamethrower, as it utilizes the same special weapon keyword, which I will once again cover. And first up here, flamethrower weapons are going to ignore cover, along with the -2 to hit from down orders, meaning once your flamethrower is in range, it's going to have pretty good odds of hitting your opponents, and they're not going to have any last-ditch reactionary actions to protect themselves from the incoming fire. After that, flamethrower weapons are also going to ignore the effects of units being inside buildings or behind gun shields, which would usually confer a -1 to wound, meaning with a penetration value of 3, the flamethrower is going to be inflicting wounds almost always on a 2+, making it an incredibly lethal infantry killer. After that, while we are on the topic of penetration values, the Flamethrower is not going to lose penetration at long range, meaning even if you are firing this vehicle Flamethrower at 12 inches, you are still going to have a penetration value of 3, it's not going to drop by 1 like most other projectile weapons. And when targeting enemy vehicles, you will always count as hitting their top armor, which will give you a bonus penetration value of +1 or +2 if you are targeting an open-topped vehicle. So when targeting enemy armor, this is going to have the same penetrating value of a light anti-tank gun, and when targeting vehicles with the open-topped keyword, and mind you, vehicles that use their pintle-mounted MMGs that turn count as open-topped, you will gain a penetration value equal to that of a medium anti-tank gun. So based on stats alone, this is going to be a very viable weapon for killing both infantry and vehicles. However, the real kicker of the Flamethrower is the fact that they apply D3 +1 pins when hitting a target, and then immediately force that target into making a morale test. If that morale test is failed, the target is then destroyed. This includes both vehicles and infantry alike. And for those of you listening who are less familiar with the math hammer behind Bolt Action's pin and morale system, this pretty much means on average, when a unit's hit by a Flamethrower, you're going to have to take a 50-50 coin flip to see whether they're going to retreat off the table or not. And that's actually being pretty generous towards the player on the receiving end. Usually it is actually going to be worse than a 50-50 chance. And if a Flamethrower attack would cause a unit to drop below half their strength, they will have to take another morale test on top of the forced one from the Flamethrower attack. And in that scenario, you're pretty much all but guaranteed to lose the unit. It's an incredibly devastating effect, and I have a lot of issues with it, most of which I covered in the previous Flamethrower video, so I will spare you the time. However, Flamethrowers do have one drawback in their special keyword, and that is after you perform an attack, you must roll a d6, and on a roll of 1, you have run out of fuel in your fuel tanks and can no longer attack with the Flamethrower. Now, on the infantry support squad, this counts as them being destroyed as they no longer have a weapon and must retreat off the table. But fortunately for vehicles, you can still stay on the battlefield and use your other weapons, such as a hull-mounted MMG, and your Flamethrower will no longer be usable rather than chalking the entire unit up as a casualty. However, flame vehicles do have one other disadvantage on them, and that is the internal volatile fuel tanks special rule, meaning whenever a Flamethrower vehicle would receive damage, you are going to add +1 to the roll for that damage table, which will of course increase the chances of this vehicle being destroyed, and allow for knockouts even on superficial hits. And that is definitely a very, very large drawback. It makes penetrating hits go from killing this vehicle on a 4+ to killing it on a roll of 3+, which makes it all around more vulnerable and susceptible to being destroyed. Now, there are a few Flamethrower vehicles out there that have the jettison fuel tank special rule that negates this drawback, such as the Churchill Crocodile, but they are very far and few in between. And when you consider how close this weapon needs to get to its enemies in order to engage them, you are going to be exposing your side and rear armor more than you usually would on a vehicle, while also making yourself more vulnerable to infantry assaults. And that definitely is one of the major drawbacks to the vehicle-mounted Flamethrowers that are going to reel them in and make them a bit more balanced than your standard Flamethrower support team. But with all those stat lines wrapped up, let's get into the nitty-gritty and examine why vehicle-mounted Flamethrowers aren't as popular as their infantry counterparts. And first up, I want to mention that these do not have their own slots in the reinforced platoon, something that is definitely a major perk to the standard Flamethrower team, and vehicles that do have Flamethrowers mounted on them are almost always coming in that highly coveted armor slot on your reinforced platoon, which is much more commonly reserved for your hard anti-tank counters or dedicated infantry killers, be it a vehicle with a ton of machine guns or a very large high explosive profile. And while the Flamethrower vehicle can technically fulfill both of these roles, it's not exactly effective at doing it thanks to that limited range. And any opponent who brings long-range anti-tank measures is likely going to be able to engage and slow, if not outright destroy, your Flamethrower vehicle before it can even start to squirt off shots. Most Flamethrower vehicles simply do not get to engage your opponent until turn 4 or 5, again due to that limited range, and that gives your opponent plenty of time to plink away at them as they march across the battlefield. Also, as I mentioned earlier, having to get within 12 inches of your enemy targets will put the vehicle in unsavory positions, so the closer you get to actually pulling off your attack, the more vulnerable you will likely become. And while we're on the topic of vulnerability, this will move us along to my next main point, and that is the fact that vehicles are simply larger targets than a small man infantry squad. They're easier to see, they're easier to hit, and they are harder to hide. And as I mentioned in my previous video on the Flamethrower support team, one of the best tactics for them is playing cat and mouse with your opponents and hiding behind line of sight obscuring terrain, which can be a very potent form of area denial, as your opponent will not be able to enter an area without suffering a vicious retaliation from the flamethrower attack, something that is just a lot harder to pull off when you have a large vehicle that you're trying to hide rather than a two-man squad, and something that is also just a tactic that's really not going to net you your points return on a flamethrower vehicle. After that, we are going to have the issue of effective range on these flamethrower vehicles, and at face value, you would think the flamethrower vehicles would come out on top here. They move further than infantry squads, they shoot further than the infantry flamethrower, but at the end of the day, most flamethrower vehicles are tracked vehicles that only move 9 to 18 inches and have a limited number of pivots they can make during an advance order, and with fully tracked vehicles unable to turn at all during a run order. Combine that with the fact that many of these vehicle flamethrowers that aren't turret mounted are locked into specific firing arcs, and you are going to have much more restrictive movement when maneuvering a vehicle mounted flamethrower than you would with an infantry support squad. But the effective range of moving and shooting is still superior, right? Well, not exactly. As I discussed in my previous video and other videos, it is very popular to throw these infantry support weapons into jeeps or other light transports, and throw them at your enemy with an advance order, and then have the squad jump out with another advance order and engage your opponent. And when you consider the fact that a jeep is going to be moving 12 inches on an advance order, with the flamethrower team disembarking with a 6-inch move and then engaging with a 6-inch range on their weapon, the effective range of a flamethrower mounted in a jeep is going to be 24 inches. Meanwhile, a tank with a flamethrower mounted on it is going to be moving 9 inches on an advance order, and then firing that flamethrower up to 12 inches for a total of 21 inches, which is very obviously shorter than 24 inches. On top of that, if you are stretching and engaging your opponent at the maximum range here, the vehicle-mounted flamethrower is going to be suffering a -1 to hits thanks to the long-range hit modifier. Meanwhile, the infantry flamethrower mounted in the Jeep is going to have that negative hit modifier mitigated by the close quarters hit modifier, meaning the flamethrower team that's mounted in the Jeep is not only going to have a longer, more maneuverable, effective range, but also a better chance of hitting their targets when they do make that mad dash. On top of that, a flamethrower team mounted in a Jeep is going to cost you 71 points at regular, and 86 points if the flamethrower squad is upgraded to veteran, which is remarkably cheaper than almost any flamethrower mounted armored vehicle in the game. And that brings us to our final drawback for the vehicle-mounted flamethrower, something you will see come up continuously throughout the course of this unit guide, and that is very simply the fact that vehicles do not scale well in points in bolt action, and for the most part tend to be overcosted investments that often allow your opponent to out-activate and outmaneuver your force on the battlefield. However, with vehicle-mounted flamethrowers only costing about 50 points, again on par with light howitzers or light AT guns, it's actually a pretty balanced weapon to have on armored vehicles. If you look at the points cost for vehicles like the Flamingo or the Panzer III Flam, you're actually getting a pretty respectable package in terms of points to offensive capabilities. Now, you still are suffering all of the drawbacks I previously mentioned, and it is going to be quite hard to actually get this unit into combat, but if the stars align and you can get this unit into combat by turn 4, there's a good chance you will be able to make your points back. However, it is going to be a very high priority target for your opponent, as all tanks usually are, and should you lose that investment or simply fail to maneuver it properly, it will once again become a major point sink. So overall, the major perks you get from the inexpensive vehicle flamethrower are pretty much mitigated by the inherent flaws that very deeply plague armored vehicles in bolt action, and that pretty much just levels out this weapon profile to something that is more or less just balanced. It is a very powerful weapon profile, however, it is difficult to pull it off, and with vehicles being overcosted and the flamethrower being undercosted, it just kind of levels out to a pretty much fair price point. That being said, vehicle-mounted flamethrowers aren't super common in bolt action, and when they do appear, it is very often on somewhat funky platforms, such as the Flamethrower Hanomag, which often have way too much risk associated with them for most players to put them in to that highly coveted armor slot in the reinforced platoon. However, closed-top, light, and medium armored tanks who sport a turret-mounted flamethrower are actually a decent wildcard pick in my opinion, but you need to make sure the shortcomings of this vehicle are going to be shored up in other elements of your reinforced platoon. But before I end this video, I am going to bring up the Churchill Crocodile. I know you guys would be upset if I didn't. It's a legendary vehicle, and in pen and paper, it is one of the most impressive vehicle loadouts in bolt action, as it not only sports a hull-mounted flamethrower, but also a turret-mounted medium anti-tank gun with a 6-pounder, meaning this unit is definitely capable of eliminating both an armored vehicle and an entire infantry squad in one activation, which is certainly remarkable, though it's extremely hard to actually pull off. However, with the super heavy tank profile armor value of 11, this unit is going to be quite hardy and will make an absolute mess if it smashes into your opponent's lines. But at 500 points, if you mess up a single turn with this vehicle, you are likely not going to see a return on your investment. This thing really needs to work overtime, as it does have the slow keyword, and if it gets pinned down for a turn or simply can't reach your opponent's forces, this lumbering behemoth is going to provide you underwhelming results. It's definitely a very fun and interesting vehicle, but one that I would not recommend using in matches under 1250 points, as it really is just too expensive to reliably work in most matches. Yes, you will have those legendary games where this thing vaporizes 4 squads of infantry and 2 vehicles, but I think an experienced opponent will know how to not let that happen to them, and for every match where that does happen, you're going to have multiple other ones where it simply just doesn't pull its points worth. I'm not saying don't play with this vehicle, because it is a ton of fun to use, but if you're looking for a competitive heavy tank, perhaps look at the Churchill AVRE instead, as it is a very potent infantry wiping vehicle that has a much more effective range. But there you have it, my opinion on the Churchill Crocodile. Let me know how wrong I am in the comments down below. But in all seriousness, let me know what you guys think about vehicle-mounted flamethrowers. What is your favorite fire-spitting vehicle? And which ones do you think are the most fun to use versus the most competitive to use? As always, if you enjoyed the video, go ahead and leave a like. And if you want to see more of this bolt action unit guide, consider subscribing to the channel and turning on notifications. As I said earlier, it is going to be a comprehensive series that covers most of the unit profiles and bolt action. And I would love for you guys to stick around and see the rest of it and give further input on what does and what doesn't work in bolt action. So until next time, as always, take care.